All right. So, welcome everybody for the third session. I hope we're all nourished and energized. So, for this third session, we're normally here in Rise we focus on the systems, and in a lot of cases, what that means is we end up focusing on providers. So the ministries, the schools, the principals, and the teachers. But these are, of course, affected dramatically by the users of the systems, the parents and the students. So these are endogenous to the demand side. So it's hard to reform a system if the parents and students reject your model of education. We've seen that with mother tongue instruction studies in Kenya and early child education studies in Ghana, where if parents don't buy in, then you're out. So in this session, we're going to focus on the demand side. So what happens when we do things that change how households look at schooling. First, we're going to hear from Priya Mukherjee, who will talk about the market for after-school tutoring in Delhi's low-income neighborhoods. So for better or for worse, after-school tutoring is a huge part of the education process in a lot of countries. It's a big part of the system, and we ignore it to our peril. Then we'll hear Maulik Jagnani, who will talk about an experiment looking at parental preferences for equality across siblings. Again, looking at the outcomes within the context of after-school tutoring, in this time in Malawi. And then we'll have two papers on cost reductions. And obviously we've seen a fair amount about cost reductions over the years, but specifically today we'll see how the design of these cost reduction programs, both the framing and the targeting, can have dramatic impacts as to whether they actually help the children that we're hoping to help. So we'll hear Rafael Hoyos sharing short-term results from Mexico, and Felipe Barrero Osorio will talk about longer-term results from Cambodia. And together these should help us to fill in this picture of what this demand side, what the parents that are then influencing the systems, what they actually want and what they actually do. So we'll turn it over to Priya.
Oh, is that a clicker?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so it's really nice to be here. So this is an experiment that we ran some years ago, but it's nice to present it to this audience. We haven't presented at Rise before, so I'm really happy to be here. So this is joint work with Jim Berry, who's in the audience. He's at Delaware. I'm at William and Mary. Okay, so I'll start with some motivation for why we were interested in studying the demand side in this fairly thick market, which is private after-school tutoring. I'll tell you a little bit about our context, but I'll start with the motivation first. So as many of us know, in the developing world, there's an increasing reliance on private education. So the private sector within education, so that consists of both private schools as well as less formal after-school tutoring. And I think there's been quite a bit of work now looking at the quality of private schools, the value added and so on, but there's far less work on this section of the private education market, and that's what our focus is going to be on. So on the supply side, there's different sorts of players. So there's for-profit providers, there's NGOs, there might be missionary schools as well. Schools as well as tutors. So what are the common reasons cited for why these markets actually exist in spite of there being large public sector with respect to education? So common reasons cited is poor quality of public schools, in particular high teacher absenteeism, poor teaching, infrastructure, and so on. In many contexts, especially in the context of India, where this study is based, there's also demand for English instruction, whereas the public schools, even now, the medium of instruction is typically not English, it's a local language. And why this demand for English instructions? It's, anecdotally, at least parents think that the labor market outcomes for their children might be better if they know some English. So India follows this sort of pattern. So this is some data that we got from USER from some years ago, and this is showing you private school enrollment and also paid tuition attendance for grades 1 through 5 and grades 6 through 8 separately. So the solid lines are private schools, and this is showing you that even within a fairly short span of time, which is 2011 through 14, there's been a gradual increase in the amount of enrollment in private schools. Similarly, you see similar patterns also for private tuitions for both upper primary, which is grade 6 through 8, as well as for primary school children as well. And so one thing I want to also mention here is that this data is for rural areas. In urban areas, these numbers are supposed to be even larger. For our data, which is from Delhi, which is the capital, in the slum areas with low-income households, 78% of children had attended some form of private tutoring in the past year. Okay, so that just gives you a sense of the scale of the use of these kinds of private services. So what is our focus going to be on? So there's obviously lots of open questions in understanding these markets on the supply side, demand side, also looking at the effectiveness. So these are the open questions that there are in general, but we're just going to sort of scratch the surface. It's one of the first, maybe second studies looking at this market that we are aware of. So we'll be looking at private after-school tutoring in Delhi slums, and our focus is going to be on price, use, and impacts. Okay, so our main questions involve understanding the demand for private tuitions and also understanding the role of prices in utilization and impacts. So just briefly, we'll partner with an NGO who's a supplier of these tutoring services. So it runs 21 tutoring centers in slums throughout the city, and spread all over the city. It was interested in raising prices in order to raise revenue, in order to meet their costs, but they were unsure about how this would change demand. And something that they said anecdotally when initially I was going and talking to them and thinking about what work we could do together, their general impression was that charging money actually results in higher attendance somehow. So they had some kind of a sunk cost psychological, at least anecdotally, that's the sort of mechanism that they were thinking of that might happen, but they were also concerned that prices might be screening out certain types of households. And then they were also interested in understanding impacts. So that was a starting point for our work. So what are our research questions? So we have several, so I'm listing them here. So we're going to, we did a randomized pricing experiment to address these questions. First, what are the initial levels of demand at different prices? So as you can guess, we will be randomizing prices. We'll have different price bins. Second, what are the characteristics of households who are willing to pay more, just to understand what are the kinds of households that value this and are willing to pay more. And then finally, understanding the role of prices. So how do prices influence attendance or utilization? So we break this up into two parts. The first is, does an initial willingness to pay reflect some sort of private information? So this we're calling the selection effect. So maybe households have some sort of private knowledge of their kid, the extent to which they may or may not benefit from these classes, something that the policymaker or the experimenter is not able to see. So can prices help us understand the selection? So does an initial willingness to pay reflect private information, in which case if you do have a higher willingness to pay, that should reflect in higher attendance and less dropout. So essentially higher utilization if you do have a higher willingness to pay. Second, what's the effect of a higher price itself? So how does the ongoing price influence continued participation? This is what we're calling the causal effect. So it's different from the selection effect. So if you keep on paying a higher price, because the fees will be paid for the whole school year on a monthly basis, it's on the one hand, it's possible that higher prices may increase dropout if households decide to continue on an ongoing basis just because it's turning out to be expensive. But it's possible that this negative effect could be offset by a psychological sunk cost type effect, or a psychological effect as is mentioned in the literature. So utilization might actually be higher because you've paid, and then it's sort of like a commitment device, and you sort of force your kid to go because you've paid. So our experimental design, which I'll describe in just a second, is going to help us disentangle these two things. And together, we think that understanding initial and ongoing demand can help inform pricing policy for an organization that's working in this sector. And then finally, given the experimental variation we have in prices, we use an IV method to look at the impacts of the tutoring. Okay, so just a quick overview. I won't get into the preview of results. In the interest of time, I'll show them to you as we get to the results. So we partner with this NGO, which runs what they call learning centers, which are tutoring centers essentially, 21 of them across Delhi. We do a pricing experiment that involves 5,400 adolescent children. This is grade 6 through 8. And essentially, our methodology consists of something that's already existed. That part is not novel, although the context in which we do it is fairly new in this education sector. It's a two-part pricing design, which consists of 2 steps. First, you offer households a randomly assigned monthly price, which you tell them is going to be operating through the end of the school year. Once they credibly enroll, once they credibly take up, which means actually paying and the kid actually comes, so that's once a child enrolls, then offer a randomly assigned second price, which for feasibility and ethical reasons had to be a discount up to the original price, and that's the price that they will actually pay for the whole school year. So this first part gives you an initial willingness to pay. The second part gives you what price they're actually paying for the whole school year, the ongoing price. So this is going to allow us to separate the selection and the causal effects that I mentioned on the previous slide. In this way. So conditional on an ongoing price, does a higher initial price correlate with higher attendance? And similarly, conditional on initial price, does a higher ongoing price cause higher or lower attendance? Okay, so those are the 2 things we'll do. And like I mentioned, we measure test scores to also look at the impacts. So I should probably skip over the literature in the interest of time, because explaining the experimental protocols will take a bit of time. But there is a growing literature on private schools, but not as much on private tuitions. And there's many people in the audience that have worked on the private school literature. The experimental pricing literature is also growing and fairly large, but it's mostly in the context of the health sector, where they have the similar 2-part pricing design. You also have more sophisticated price, willingness to pay elicitation methods, which was not really feasible in our context. I'm happy to discuss that more after the presentation if you're interested in talking about that. Okay, so just one thing to point out is that our context is quite different from the other pricing stuff, most of it that's been done, because most of those other goods or services were typically one-off sales and highly subsidized products. Often households didn't know about it, whereas in our case, it's a service or a product that's relatively familiar to households. There are active markets, households know about it, and the service is also a flow for which a frequent ongoing payment is needed for the whole year. Okay, so probably skip over this slide because you already have a sense of the setting I mentioned. These are tuition centers. So this is a board. And this is, when you think of slums, you do have concrete buildings as well. They're just not, maybe formally acknowledged by the city. So our focus is grade 6 through 8, and the curriculum is based on the school curriculum. So their goal is to get the kids to teach the school curriculum and make them do well on the school exams. And their tests are also similar to the sorts of exams they would be having in school. They're fairly intensive, 6 days per week, 2 hours per day in different slots. And classes are for groups of up to 20 students. So initially, classes used to be free. They started charging fees for a number of reasons that I mentioned, but they didn't know what effect the prices might have, and they also wanted to understand demand, and we were able to convince them to do a pricing experiment. So in the pre-experimental year, prices varied quite a bit, but we tried to make it uniform. So this is what we do. So we set a posted price at 200 for 6th grade, 250 for 7th and 8th grade. That's the posted price. And then these are the randomized price bins, 075, 150, and the posted price. After the household has enrolled the child and started paying, we randomly offer a second price. And our sample consists of different groups: kids that are already enrolled, kids that are newly enrolled. So already enrolled are those kids that were enrolled in the previous academic year. And then our results also include these fixed effects and so on. So this is just giving you a sense of the surveys that we do. So the households are given a short survey, child takes the baseline test that we wanted, and then the price offers were done in a way that is similar to the way Pratham or this NGO essentially recruited kids from the slum areas, and we followed a similar protocol. And we also use scratch cards to make sure that the households perceive this as a lottery, and they really felt like the prices were random and price is not a signal of quality. Second price was done similarly. Okay, so demand. This has sanity check. Demand is downward sloping. At a price of 0, 69% of students enroll. Elasticity at 75 rupees is about 0.27. If you look at the coefficients flexibly with the price dummies on the right-hand side, this is what it looks like. And this is what it looks like separately for previously enrolled kids, which is blue, and then the newly enrolled kids, which is green. And the patterns are like what you would expect. Then we look at correlates of willingness to pay using a probit model, because we don't actually have willingness to pay. What we have is take up at different prices. So I'll skip just the regression that we do. But what stands out is that households are less willing to pay for female children, and they're also far less willing to pay for kids that attend private school, which means these are like substitutes essentially, private school versus private tutoring. And what's surprising is that assets doesn't really stand out, and neither does. We tried different versions of this, but these are the ones that, these are the kinds of households that are willing to pay more versus less for their kids. Okay, so here are some attendance figures. So this is just the raw data showing you what attendance looks like across the whole school year. So you see it's falling, but most of this is driven actually by dropout. And if you condition on some attendance, then attendance, across, on the intensive margin, it's not really falling as such. So then finally getting into selection and causal effects. I'm almost out of time. So we find strong selection effects. So those willing to pay 100 rupees higher first price were 5 percentage points, were attending 5 percentage point more classes. So this is fairly strong selection effects. Causal effects, so this is the one that we weren't sure of. Would it be positive or negative? On net, we find very strong negative effects. So 100 rupee higher ongoing price that they paid is associated with 12 percentage points lower attendance, and this is quite strongly monotonic across the price bins as well. So that's a selection and causal effects. Finally, treatment effects, and maybe I'll end here. Don't be fooled by these. These are our IV estimates, and there is nothing. So using our random price first price as an IV, we find no effects on English or math test scores. We do see some heterogeneous effects, which maybe we should push more given the stuff that David was saying earlier this morning. There's some heterogeneity for English test scores. It's higher scores for low-income households and higher for girls. Okay, so I won't go into exactly what happened. Maybe we can discuss later. So I'm happy to take more questions at the end. Thank you.
Start, I guess. So I'm Maulik. I'll be presenting Not Playing Favorites. This is joint work with Jim again. If you're sick and tired of his papers, you can leave now. There's a second paper in this session, and Rebecca Dizon-Ross is a new from Chicago. So it is well known that It is well known that parents' investments in their children have persistent, profound impacts on their children's outcomes. However, we know little about parents' preferences for investing in their children. Do parents treat investing in their children as standard investment goods, choosing to maximize returns, but potentially leading to cross-sibling inequality, or are they averse to cross-sibling inequality? And if they are averse to cross-sibling inequality, are they inequality averse in outcomes, like earnings that their children, or the money their children ultimately earn? Or are they inequality averse in inputs, such as expenditure in tutoring or textbooks? Understanding these preferences can help governments design better policies by predicting how parents would respond to the changing features. Wait a second. All right. All right, to the changing features of the economic environment. So consider, for example, one of the most prevalent social policies in the developing world, conditional cash transfer programs, which often only affect one child in the household, or the targeted child. And governments would like to know the spillover effects on the non-targeted child, or the child who's not directly affected by this policy. And this will depend on parents' preferences, right? For example, if the parents are returns maximizers, then the conditional cash transfer program, by changing, or rather by increasing the relative returns of investing in the targeted child, may have negative spillovers on the non-targeted child. On the other hand, if parents have a preference for equalizing outcomes, then it might have conditional cash transfer programs might have a positive spillover on the non-targeted child. So, however, this is a hard problem to solve. It is challenging to identify parents' preferences. One, because it's difficult to know what the perceived production function looks like and generate clean behavioral predictions. For example, if you observe that parents invest more in the high-ability child, is that because they have a preference for returns maximization, or are they trying to balance returns maximization with some sort of inequality aversion? Second, it might be difficult to find sufficient variation to separately identify parameters. For example, it might be difficult to successfully distinguish an allocation which is input equalizing compared to an allocation which is output equalizing. So we overcome these challenges by using a lab in the field experiment in Malawi. To give you a brief preview of the findings, what we find is that parents put some weight on maximizing returns, but that's not the only thing they have a preference for. We reject the null that they only care about returns maximization. In fact, we find that they deviate from returns maximization because they have a strong preference for equalizing inputs. Okay? And because of the strong preference for input equalization, they tend to leave a lot of money on the table in our experiment. They leave approximately 40 to 50% of their potential earnings. So before I get into the experimental process and the experimental design, as well as the results, let me just briefly spell out the conceptual framework. So the parent's problem here is to maximize their utility by choosing x1 and x2, which is the amount spent by these parents on child 1 and 2, conditional on the observed ability of child 1 and 2, which is a1 and a2. So they do this by maximizing an objective function over their preferences for either maximizing total household earnings, minimizing the absolute gap in earnings, or minimizing the gap in inputs. Okay? So if they are a returns maximizer, if parents are returns maximizers, and if the returns to investing are higher for the high ability child, then the parents would invest more in the high ability child. On the other hand, if they're returns maximizers, but the returns to investing are more in the low ability child, then they would invest more in the low ability child. Okay? On the other hand, if parents have a preference for inequality aversion over outcomes, right, or they are averse to inequality aversion and outcomes, then they would invest more in the low ability child. And if they have a preference for inequality aversion inputs, they would invest equally in both the high ability child and the low ability child because they have a preference for equalizing inputs, the money they spent on each kid. Okay? They might also have child-specific preferences. They might favor one child over the other. I know my mom didn't favor me, for example. So they might have some sort of like that kind of preference. We're going to allow this in the paper, but I'm going to skip that because of emotional baggage I have and also in the interest of time. All right? So what are the experimental design? The experimental design is pretty straightforward. We survey, we have around 300 parents with more than 2 kids enrolled in, with at least 2 kids enrolled in grades 5 to 7. We tell parents that 2 of their kids will be taking a math test and receiving monetary earnings, which is our measure of outcomes, on the base of their performance on these test scores. Okay? We also give parents an input, which is a lottery tickets, which are a measure of inputs, 10 lottery tickets to assign tutoring, 1 hour of math tutoring that they'll assign to the kid of their choosing before they take the test. So, and they do this, and who will get tutoring will be decided on the winner of the lottery. The winner of the lottery will receive 1 hour of tutoring. Parents will allocate inputs between their kids. So the lottery tickets that they'll allocate, they can allocate all 10 tickets to one child. They can allocate 5 tickets to each child, or they can do 7-3 splits, whatever they want. But they'll allocate tickets 5 times for 5 different scenarios, because we'll have, in each scenario, we'll randomly, exogenously vary the payment function, which maps test scores to outcomes or earnings. Okay? So in some payment functions, the high ability kid will get more money for each point score on the test. In some functions, the low ability kid will get more money for each point scored on the test. In some scenarios, they'll both get the same amount of money. So that's how we'll like have clean behavioral predictions. Okay? And then one scenario will be randomly selected out of these 5, and on the basis of allocation on that scenario, the lottery tickets will be divvied up, and then one will be chosen by the parents and decided who will get the lottery. Okay? All right, so to actually speak briefly about the experimental process, so this is mostly clear. So parents answered, so basically how we started was we first asked parents about their beliefs. That is how they think their kids will perform with and without tutoring. That also gave us a sense of like who parents perceive are low ability kids within the 2 kids we're sampling and who they perceive are high ability kids. We also get a sense of like who parents think will have a higher return to tutoring. Who amongst the low and high ability kid do they think will have more returns for tutoring? Okay. Then we explain them the experimental design. We do this by first walking them through 2 hypothetical scenarios, which are similar to the real scenarios, but they're not exactly the same. And we also we practice the game or the experiment with these scenarios. With the surveys, we also ask the surveys to conduct a placebo lottery with the parents. The purpose of doing this is to figure out if parents actually know how to maximize returns with lottery tickets, right? So what we do is like, it's a very simple lottery placebo where we ask parents to allocate 10 lottery tickets between 2 prizes, either 50 kwacha prize or 100 kwacha prize. The returns maximizing allocation would be to allocate all 10 tickets to the 100 kwacha prize. We just want to figure out if they know how to do this with the lottery tickets. Okay. Then we ask parents to allocate tickets. So before doing that, the survey explains each of the functions of each payment function of every scenario of the 5 scenarios we have. So first we explain the scenario, then we elicit the allocation for that scenario, move on to the second scenario, do the same thing. Okay, so till all the 5 scenarios are done. When walking parents through each scenario, we help use visual aids, and we also tell parents exactly which is the allocation for that particular scenario that will maximize returns, which is the allocation. For example, an allocation is 10 tickets to high ability child and 0 tickets to low ability child will maximize allocation for this particular scenario. We tell them that. We also tell them which allocation will equalize outcomes and which allocation will equalize inputs. Okay. Then parents allocate 10 lottery tickets between their 2 children for each of those scenarios. Okay, so finally, the surveyor's tablets randomly selects one scenario, and the allocation on that particular scenario is used to divvy up tickets between the 2 children. So for example, if scenario 3 was selected by the tablet, we'll see what was the allocation on scenario 3 and like divvy up the tickets. Let's say it was 7-3, 7 tickets to this guy, 3 to this guy, and then ask and write those names, and then ask the parents to randomly pick one and decide who will get tutoring. All right. So then the winning child receives the tutoring, and then all children take a math test. Surveyors deliver cash reward based on the child's performance as well as the scenario selected, or the payment function for the scenario selected. A key note here is that the use of cash biases us against finding returns maximization, because parents can always like just biases us against finding inequality aversion, because parents could always maximize returns and then divvy up the earnings later on. Okay? So it's a key point to note as I walk through my results, which is now, before I walk through my main results, let's just talk about how they allocated tickets in the placebo lottery. Well, they know how to maximize returns in this very simple hypothetical lottery that we played. We asked them to allocate tickets between a low value price and a high value price, 50 kwacha versus 100 kwacha. Almost 97% of the parents allocated all 10 tickets to the larger price. However, things are very different when we ask them to divvy tickets for across scenarios. So let's just pool how they divvied tickets across scenarios. So all 289 parents across 5 scenarios, let's just pool it, and we see that it's inconsistent with Pure's returns maximization. Almost 40% of the parents decided to allocate 5 tickets each to both the low ability child and the high ability child. Okay, so what's going on? So what kind of weights do parents put on return maximization, inequality aversion over inputs, or inequality over IA over outcomes? It seems like IA over inputs is at least from the histogram I showed you, is the dominant, but let's tease this up a bit more, given I have 4 minutes. That might be tough, but hopefully we'll try. So let's compare how parents move from scenario 1 to scenario 2. So this will help us figure out if parents actually did move or did respond to financial returns to tutoring. So in the base case of scenario 1, both the low ability child and high ability child received 10 kwacha per point scored on the test. So that meant that the returns maximizing allocation for at least 66% of the parents for who thought that the increase in test scores is due to tutoring will be larger for the high ability kid compared to the low ability kid, the prediction would be to allocate more tickets to the high ability kid. Okay? But for 86% of the parents, if they have a preference for IA over outcomes, the allocation would be to allocate more tickets to the low ability kid because they perceive that kid to be low ability, to give him or her tutoring so they can get more earnings and equalize outcomes that way. The prediction for IA over inputs is allocating both 5 tickets to the low ability child and the high ability child. So how things will change in the second scenario is that although the low ability child will still get 10 kwacha per point scored on the test, the high ability child will now get 100 kwacha per point scored on the test. That means the returns to tutoring are significantly higher for the high ability child compared to the low ability child. So for the prediction, if parents would return maximizers, and if they do respond to financial returns, more parents should now allocate tickets to the high ability child. However, if they have a preference for IA over outcomes, then even more so, they should allocate more tickets to the low ability child. Okay? But the prediction for IA over inputs or equalizing inputs doesn't really change. So what do? This is the allocation in the base case, so scenario 1, when both kids get 10 kwacha per point. As you can see, more than 40% of the parents allocate equal tickets in the base case. In the second scenario, for returns maximizers, they should move that way. That is, allocate 0 tickets to the low ability child and 10 tickets to the high ability child. What do? They do exactly that. A larger proportion, or a significantly larger proportion of the parents decide to maximize returns and give more tickets to the high ability child. Okay. However, does this mean that parents prefer returns maximization or inequality aversion? The short answer is yes. We do this, we tease this out in the following manner. We compare how parents change the allocation from scenario 2 to scenario 3. Scenario 2 is exactly what I described to you a moment ago. Scenario 3 now flips the returns. Instead of giving child H 100 kwacha per point, we give child L 100 kwacha per point and only give child H 10 kwacha per point. And the predictions also flip. Now the returns maximizer should shift their ticket allocation towards the low ability child, but the IA over outcome parent should shift their allocation towards the high ability child. And input equalizer shouldn't really change. So what do? So this is the allocation in scenario 2. IA over outcomes parents in scenario 3 should move that way. Returns maximizer should move this way. They move towards returns maximizing, okay? And not to, all right. So are parents averse to inequality, in outcomes? Not really. So let me just say that, not really, and move on because I have 22 seconds. And let me just say the following. So we saw that parents do put a positive weight on returns maximization, not really on IA over outcomes. You have to trust me and read the paper. Is this due to ex post equalizing? Possibly, but we find similar results in another experiment where they're not allowed to equalize after the experiment or after the fact. We're also running follow-up experiments, survey to look at this. Finally, we find strong preference in equality aversion of inputs. That's identified less from cross-scenario variation, since predictions don't change from scenario to scenario. We find that in 50% of the allocations or choice, they decide to split it. And we also find that the distribution has a peak of 50%, at 50%, which is indicative of a strong preference for IA over inputs. Even though the returns are changing from scenario to scenario, they're choosing to equalize inputs. And they're leaving a lot of money on the table. They are leaving approximately at least 30% of the winnings in each scenario on the table because of the strong preference for equalizing inputs. Okay? So that's the takeaway message. We also estimate a really simple structural model to get at willingness to pay to equalize out inputs. I didn't talk about it in the interest of time, but it's in the paper. We find that the high average willingness to pay to equalize inputs, almost 15% of the annual average education spending per child. And that is the paper. Thank you so much for your time.
Well done.
Yeah, thanks.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. One of the most important problems that the Mexican education system is facing is dropouts. They are highly concentrated in upper secondary, so grades 10, 11, and 12. This is also the most important problem, or one of the most important problems faced by education systems throughout Latin America. And what I'll show today are results of an attempt to address this important problem. So just for you to have a sense of the magnitude of this problem, we have around, between the period 2005 and 2016, dropouts in upper secondary in Mexico, they average 15% per year. So this compounded on the 3 years of upper secondary means that of every 10 kids that enter into upper secondary, we are losing 4. And we haven't done much to reduce the dropout rates during this period, even though we have enacted 2 curriculum reforms. We have implemented several interventions trying to reduce the problem. I am highlighting there the period where I was part of the Ministry of Education in Mexico, not because I want to be part of this reduction, but because one of the tasks that I was charged with when I started working in the ministry was to find out what was the reason behind the dropouts. And let me tell you 2 things that led me to one of my recommendations. The first one is there is a high correlation between dropouts or enrollment rates and household per capita incomes. So kids from the poorest deciles of the income distribution, they do not enroll, or if they enroll, they drop out of high school. Richer kids, they enroll and they remain and they graduate from high school or upper secondary. The second one is that we went on and implemented a survey to find out among dropouts what was the main reason behind their decision of dropping out. And we've separated this in 3, economic, family or personal, and academic related. And the kids told us, most of the kids put economic reason as being one of the most important ones behind their decision of dropping out. So with these 2 pieces of information in mind, we said, well, those are good news. If dropouts are related to an income constraint, let us just relax the income constraint, and we should see the dropouts rate falling. So we designed a program that is called PROVEMS, that it's a program that has the following characteristics. First, or the following eligibility criteria. First, you just have to apply through a portal. Second, you have to be enrolled or be expected to be enrolled in upper secondary education in a public school. Third, you don't have to be receiving any other scholarship program, mainly Progresa, Oportunidades, Prospera. And fourth, you have to be poor. You have to come from a household that has an income that is below the poverty line. And this fourth eligibility criteria was measured just through self-declared assets of the kids. So when they filled their application, they told us some characteristics of their household, and with that, we tried to identify those that were poor. Second, and you don't have to look at the details of this table here, but we were increasing the sum of money, the size of the scholarship for later grades, and we were also increasing the size of the scholarship based on how well they did in their grades. And we gave a bit more money to women than to men. We started the first year, 2007, 2008, that this PROVEMS scholarship system started. We started with around 300,000 scholarship holders. And throughout the time that I was there in the Ministry of Education, we reached nearly 500,000. But as you can see, the program continued, and it reached almost 1 million, so 900,000 plus in the forthcoming years. We designed and implemented programs along with an impact evaluation strategy, and it was a randomized controlled trial that started in March 2009. 12,000 kids that met the eligibility criteria were randomly selected into two groups. 6,000 kids were treatment, 6,000 kids were control. Out of these, we have 3.6 thousand kids that were just entering 10th grade or upper secondary, the same number among the control, and all the results that I'll show are focusing on the kids that are just entering high school. These kids, the controls, were controls for one year only, because the program, you have to apply on a year-by-year basis. So the first year that we sent the letter to these 3.6 thousand kids, you've been granted a scholarship, 2.5 got it, and a bit more than 1,000 lost their scholarship because they didn't fill the administrative process. They didn't finish the administrative process. None of the kids in the control group got a scholarship, so they respected that. Now, 1 year later, September 2010, many of these kids kept receiving a scholarship, so 2,000 out of the 2.5 that got it in the first year. Now they had to apply again. These guys were allowed to apply, and some of these guys got the scholarship. Some of these 1,000 out of these 3.6 got the scholarship. And then we followed them. We followed them through April 2012, the year when they were meant to graduate from high school, and again in 2013 to see if some of these kids were lagging behind, but they still graduated. And in Mexico, we used to have this standardized test called Enlace, that was a census-based standardized test applied during the last year of upper secondary. So that's what I'm going to use to measure three outcomes. First, whether I see the kids sitting the Enlace test. So I am comparing treatment and control. And the first thing that I'll do is what share of these kids are presenting end of high school Enlace. Then the second outcome is math. The third is Spanish, and then an average between math and Spanish. So what are the results? The results, or what I felt when I saw these results, can be summarized by this picture. The results are 0, 0, 0. 0 for graduation, 0 for math, 0 for Spanish. And here are the details. So that's the first 0. Whether I see these kids, the treatment group, at a higher rate than the control group, after 3 or 4 years after they got the scholarship, 0. Math, 0. Spanish, 0. And an average, 0. Now, after dealing with the depressing results, I thought, well, maybe this is a 0 on average, but there are some groups. Maybe if I follow Dave's recommendation, I should separate. Maybe these results are positive for girls or boys. So I did age at which they started high school, rural, urban, sex, female, male, and I'm just showing here whether they show up to the end of high school examination, so whether they finish high school or not. 0, 0, 0. I also did whether the kids were motivated or not, because we have also an end of lower secondary standardized test at 9th grade, and that is asking what's the highest degree that you expect to achieve, so whether you're motivated or not motivated, 0. I also did by type of scholarship, whether it's federal managed or state managed, 0. So, so after dealing with depression, I snap out of it, and I said, well, at least I can learn something about why these results are zero, why the effects are zero. And there are two things that I can tell you. I won't be able to unpack all the results, but there are two things that I think that are the most important coming out of this research. The first one is that the program was poorly targeted. Here I am comparing the incidence or the distribution of beneficiaries of oportunidades, the light gray line here, and the beneficiaries of our program, of PROVEMS. So you can see that the oportunidades is kind of well targeted. There are some guys from the upper deciles that are getting oportunidades, but compared to PROVEMS, they are very well targeted. And there's evidence, recent evidence by Caridad Araujo and others, and Susan Parker and others, showing that the impact of oportunidades on high school graduation is positive. It's small, but it's positive. The second one has to do with what I think is the most important lesson from this paper. What we did with the 9th grade enlace test, so with the 9th grade standardized test, we separated all the kids in our sample into 3 groups, 3 terciles, based on how they fare in math in 9th grade. So here you have the lowest tercile, and the treatment effect is 0. So within these terciles, we have treatment and control. So the effect is 0 for the lowest tercile, the effect is 0 for the middle tercile, and the effect is positive for those that are in the upper tercile. Think about these 2 terciles as being below the minimum level. So we have these normative thresholds, and the first one being insufficient. So all these kids here, and we have 60% of the guys finishing 9th grade in Mexico with an insufficient level of math. So these guys here in the lower and middle tercile are, most of them, below the insufficient level. Think about these guys here as having the minimum academic requirements to face the demands from high school. And among these guys, if you give them a scholarship, you can increase graduation rates. And actually, the sad part is that these guys are the guys that are dropping out the most. You can see here that the graduation rate is close to 60%, whereas here the graduation rate is 76% among this group. So let me finish telling you what you can infer from this. And the policy recommendations are, you should, or the government of Mexico, should redefine the program, should make it more targeted, and should probably use the resources to try to tackle the binding constraint. And what's the binding constraint? That our kids do not know the very basics of math. And if they don't know how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide, and they have to do calculus, you can give them $1 million per month, and you still wouldn't be tackling the binding constraint. Now, let me finish with a very depressing note. The government of Mexico recently announced that they are dismantling, dropping Prospera. Prospera is Oportunidades, Progresa, the well-targeted program, and they are substituting this with the Benito Juárez scholarship system, which is providing scholarships to all kids, scholarships like PROVEMS, to all kids in high school in Mexico, 4.1 million kids receiving a scholarship that has 0 impact on graduation, 0 impact on math, and 0 impact on Spanish. With that positive note, thank you very much.
Thank you, Rafa. I hope that I will lift up the spirit of the room a little bit. So this is a project with Dion Filmer, who is here at the World Bank, and a fantastic student at Harvard, Andreas de Barros. And this project started in 2008, and it was Dion working with the government of Cambodia. And basically the same question as Rafa was explaining is the government was very concerned about dropout rate, especially in grade 6. And the idea was, hey, why don't we start offering scholarships early on before that happened? And the program emerged in which there are scholarships that target grades 3 and 4. And in that program, there was the idea of trying to test if the targeting mechanism makes any difference or not. So I want you to keep an eye on something of some parallels between the previous paper and this one. This one, the idea was, hey, if you target the students using poverty-based mechanism, may be very different if you target students using merit-based mechanism. In the case of Rafa, the target is pure poverty-based. And we are going to see that that makes a huge difference in the effects of the program. So this program, as I was mentioned, started in 2008, and we have an evaluation that captured these students in 2011. And we show in that paper that actually the scholarship was able to increase the school progression and, of these students, either in the merit base or in the poverty base. Students acquire more education. In that context, we came back in 2016, 2017 to collect information on the individuals that were covered by the scholarship in 2008, and we asked what are the long-term effects of these scholarships. And we measure a lot of outcomes. We were able to measure not only, again, what happened with the school progression, but also what happened with socio-emotional skills, what happened with the labor outcome of these individuals, and what happened with the well-being, self-perceived well-being. So, as it's something that is important, let me go back. As I was saying, in 2008, I started the program. 2011, we captured again the first follow-up. And we found two things that are important to understand the results. The first one is that it doesn't matter what are the targeting mechanisms. Both the scholarships were able to increase the school attendance of these individuals. But the second finding that we found was very interesting, was that only the merit base was able to induce effects on learning outcomes. And we show in that paper that it didn't matter if the merit-based recipients were poor or not poor. Both of them, both individuals in the merit-based group, benefit in terms of impacts on learning outcomes. So in that context, we are trying to do with this new paper, when we come back to the country in 2016, we are trying to get that variation that we were able to induce early on, to try to tease out what were the effects of more exposure to school in labor outcomes. So the overview of the results is, again, we found that for both treatment groups, there is higher education attainment. There is some catch-up by the control group, but there is no perfect catch-up. Only for the merit-based treatment, we observed some effects in cognitive skills among the poor individuals. So only those individuals that we were able to, first of all, offer the merit base, and individuals that were poor among those, we found effects in cognitive outcomes. We don't find effects in labor outcomes, and we don't find effects on socio-emotional skills. And we have positive effects on well-being for merit-based treatment. This is the overview of results, and I am going to unpack those results. This paper touched to now emerging literature on what are the long-term effects of these programs. And I think that this is a very important line of research, because we usually, we were able to measure 10 years ago what happened with this type of programs after 1 year, but now we have been able to start measuring long-term effects, and I think that is a very important process that we are seeing in this line of research. Something that is, of course, obvious is that context matters and the design matters. And I'm going to try to talk to those two issues in the program that we are doing. Another point that I want to do very fast about the emerging literature is that, and Jisnu was making this point early on, was that we are trying to see what are the effects of this program in socio-emotional outcomes. And we need to have a very clear understanding, first of all, what are the instruments that are appropriate to measure socio-emotional outcomes in a developing country, which is not clear whatsoever. And secondly, and perhaps equally important, we need to start understanding how schools are producing these socio-emotional skills, if they are producing. And we are trying to speak to this literature with this program. So let me go into the design of the intervention. This is, we are going to use grade 4 scholarships in 3 rural provinces in Cambodia that has the highest average dropout rates in the upper primary grades. And all these kids come from, go to public primary schools. These are a highly rural area. And what we did is the following, and this is the key part to understand the design. So we have, let's say, 200 schools. 100 schools are controlled, and 100 schools are treated. In the 100 schools treated, we have 2 types of treatment, merit and poverty. How do we do that? So in the 200 schools, we collect information about a test scores that we perform, and about assets of the kids in the household. We grade the test scores. We create a poverty index using the assets, and we have this information for everyone in those 200 schools. In the merit schools, in 50 of the merit schools, we go to the school once we have the information, and we arrive to the classroom and we say, kids, half of you are going to receive a merit-based scholarship based on the test that you did yesterday, a couple of days ago, and these are the numbers, and we say the numbers. So half of the classroom receive the merit scholarship, half of classroom doesn't receive the scholarship. For the poverty base, we do the same thing. We arrive to the classroom, we say, kids, half of you are going to receive a scholarship based on the index, poverty index, and this is the kids, and we read the list, and the kids receive the scholarship, and half of them receive the scholarship, half of not. And in the control group, we don't do anything, and we just follow them in time. The scholarship is a very small amount. It's $20 per year. If kids, by the way, there is a conditionality that is not enforced in any way, in a meaningful way. When we say, hey, you receive the scholarship for both groups, We said, you need to perform well in the school, you need to come to the school, and if you do that, you are entitled to receive the scholarship next year, and the kids can receive the scholarship for 3 years. These $20 per year represent more or less 3.3 of the mean high school expenditure per capita per year in Cambodia. So it is not very high, it is not very low. We think that it has some bite, but it's 3.3% of the mean high school expenditure. Here is a graphical representation of the scholarship. So we have a control group, and in the merit one, we have half of the classroom receiving the scholarship, half or not. And what we need to do is to compare these people who received the scholarship versus these people who didn't receive the scholarship but were similar to the ones receiving the scholarship, but they didn't because they were in the control group. And in the same one, in the poverty one, we need to compare the people who receive the poverty scholarship, which are these people in this area, versus the control group that have the same characteristics. And basically, that's the comparison that we do. We are pulling the total sample, and there is one group that is common in all of them. So you see that there is people who receive the scholarship that are high achievers and poor, who is in this corner, or who are poor and high achievers in this corner. So we can compare what happened with these people versus this one, and this, and this. And that is a comparison that is important to keep in mind. So the estimation framework, we are going to give you 3 types of results. One is what happened if we offer the scholarship independent of poverty or merit. Then we are going to open what happened by targeted strategy. And what we are going to show you is a type of regression that is treatment versus poverty. And we are going to be able to compare the effect of poverty targeting versus merit targeting. And finally, this is where we can compare what happened with high achiever poor kids receiving merit, high achiever poor kids receiving poverty scholarship. What is the data? So we have in-person interviews at the households. You cannot imagine how it is to come back to Cambodia to find people after 10 years of not beginning of the experiment. So we went back to the households. We used tablets. We have the list of scholarship. We have a subsample of these kids that we decide to target to this new collection of data. We have all the forms and baseline tests in 2008. We have, in order to get precision, we try to link with the MEs of Cambodia. Also, we have some information at the village level. So I am going to show you a lot of outcomes, and we follow the construction of family indexes, and I am going to show you family indexes, and then I am going to try to unpack all of this. So what are the type of data that we collect? As I was mentioned, we have education attainment, formal, informal completion. We have cognition. We have an adaptive math test. This is the first time that I think that, this is an adaptive math test that we were able to do it because we have the tablets, which was very cool. We have a fluent intelligence test. We have working memory. We have a Peabody test. We have the socio-emotional outcomes. We have emotional behavioral symptoms, SUK, and we have big 5 personality traits. We have labor market outcomes. We collect a lot of labor market data like pay, no pay, employment, formal, informal, etc. And we have also some questions about their own perceived social status, asset index, life satisfaction, quality of health, quality of life, and general health questionnaire. So we focus on a sample of eligible students, and first of all, we have a balance of the baseline characteristics. Attrition is systematically related to treatment status. However, it's balanced and in the characteristics that we observe. And all the results that we are going to show you are, we use also inverse probability weights, and they are fairly consistent. So what are the results? So here, the results are in family indices, so education, cognition, socio-emotional outcomes, labor index, and well-being of the individuals. And the first set of results is when we have treatment, the treatment increase educational outcomes, the index of educational outcomes, but it doesn't have any effect in cognition, socio-emotional, or labor, and it has some effect in well-being. When we unpack that, we observe the following. So in educational outcomes, it's very consistent effects of any treatment. These are positive either in highest grade complete or formal education. In terms of cognitive outcomes, in the math score, Ravens, the forward vocabulary recognition, the effects are fairly close to zero. In terms of the socio-emotional outcomes, again, any treatment the effects are zero. In terms of the labor outcomes, the only effect that is positive is currently working, which is this one, but the rest are zero. Some of them are very noisy. And in the well-being, we have, again, there are some effects that are showing up about health perception, about perception of the individuals. When we open by targeting, we observe the following. We observe that the effects of the merit versus the poverty, which are the two panels, there is still effects of education, but it's higher for the poverty-based individuals, and the effects of cognitive outcomes, this is marginal significant, and this is significant for merit and not for poverty. And then what happened is the following. The effect of cognitive outcomes are concentrated in individuals who receive the merit-based, but they are poor. And those are the only effects that we see in cognitive. The effects on poverty are zero and fairly well estimated. And also in the merit, we observe that there is a positive effect for the merit-based poor individuals. Finally, gender. In gender, the story is depressing in one way, which is all the effects that we observe there is a bigger effect for girls in school progression and the education index, but bigger than, at least the point estimated bigger than for boys. But the effects of cognitive are higher for boys, and the effects of self-perception of well-being are higher for boys. So we observe positive effect by gender in the sense that boys have higher effects. So in conclusion, targeting matters, and it matters in a fundamental way in the sense that if you arrive and you say to a kid, you are going to receive a scholarship because you are smart, that can trigger some effects that are very different from a scholarship that says you are going to receive because you are poor. And those effects last, at least for instance, in self-perception and well-being of these individuals in the long run. And what is striking is that the same individual, a poor high achiever, have very different behavioral responses to the targeting if the kid is merit-based poor, you observe long-term effects. If the kid is poverty-based merit, that person don't show any effects in the long run. So with that, I conclude. Thank you.
All right.
Holy cow.
All right, let's get our.
I feel
get our
exhausted,
panelists up.
dude.
20 slides more to go.
No, that was it.
Those were the appendix.
Yeah.
We were worried because we were seeing 53 out of 53 slides.
All right, so we've heard 4 great talks, with looking at both scholarships, after-school tutoring, parental preferences. So I've got lots of questions, but I will defer to the audience. So who has questions for our speakers? We'll take a round of a few questions at once. Yes.
ProBEMS program. Based on the self-reports, economic reasons are the main reasons for dropouts. So I was wondering how large the scholarships are relative to the returns to schooling or the wages or the cost of schooling. And related to that, how do you, your results are that students who have low baseline scores don't really benefit from scholarships or don't really, there's no effect on their retention in school. So how is that consistent with the self-reports again, in which academics is not really the main reasons that keeps students out of school, and it's economic for the most part?
And then Marek.
So yeah, Marika from University of Illinois. I have a question for Rafael as well. Just curious, given that you're so familiar with the context. So I want to follow up on your very negative message, right? So the government has decided to discontinue Progressa, continue with Promise. Can you give a little bit of insight onto the why? Like, is it the case that they don't know what they're doing? Are they not aware of some of the many impact evaluations done? Or is it a preference from the government to sort of like not go for this kind of pro-poor approach? I'm just curious of the political economy around it.
And then this gentleman in the white shirt right here.
Alec Gershberg from the University of Pennsylvania and from RISE. Question for Rafael. You started with the perceived reasons for dropouts, and economic was high and academic performance was low. I wonder if you could bring us full circle back around and say, based on your findings, it seems like that self-perception may be inaccurate, right? That that it does come around to academic reasons why they drop out, and there's an issue that they don't perceive that. So I wonder if you could connect that. And then I guess for the last 2 papers taken together, do we conclude then that we're not going to conditional cash transfer and small scholarship our way out of the learning crisis?
Let's jump over here with Owen.
Thank you. Owen Ozier from the research group at the World Bank. I had a question for Maulik. In your study, I was curious what the distribution both of levels of the test scores upon which the incentives were sort of based were. So what's the distribution of that? Does anybody max out the test? Is anybody at the bottom? But maybe more importantly, what's the distribution of impacts? Because I think you can estimate that. So as a function of your baseline ability, is the effect of the tutoring homogeneous in terms of the test score improvement that is delivered as a function of the level? Thanks.
Thanks. And let's take one more. This gentleman up against over by the wall.
Hi, I had a question for Maulik again. You say inequality aversion, but could you tell us a bit more about the characteristics of, did that vary with how close together the children were in terms of perhaps age or something like that? So is it inequality aversion or is it peace affinity in the household or something like that?
All right, let's do one round of answers, and then we'll come around. Why don't we go ahead and start with Priya, and we'll just go across the panel.
I didn't have any questions.
Oh, I thought that was the one on the, okay, that was from Maulik, sorry. All right,
All right,
then we'll come circle back around.
So to Owen,
So we haven't looked at the impacts of tutoring. I think that's something we should definitely look at. If they're homogeneous, I'm not sure we have. So something to definitely look at. As far as the distribution of test scores is concerned, the beliefs parents were like their beliefs were such that they overestimated how good their children are and how well they perform on this test, and in reality they were not as good and there's like a wide distribution for that. So that's what I'll say on that. As far as the inequality aversion, is that something else? So if parents have like some like preference for like the older kid or some sort of like male or female, that will be captured by the child-specific preferences. But as far as heterogeneity is concerned, we looked at that, we didn't really find anything. We found that more educated parents were more likely to have a preference for inequality aversion, but that's about it.
Rafa, with the 9 questions that you had.
So let me try to address first what I consider is the easiest of the questions, which is the size of the scholarship. And this is roughly $57 per month. And that is more or less the extreme poverty line. So that'll give you a sense of the size of the transfer. Now, in terms of the opportunity cost, so this is much less than what the kids would be earning in the labor market. So kids that are dropouts from high school, they are earning around $200 per month. So this is obviously not compensating for the opportunity cost. Now, the reasons why the kids are self-declaring economic reasons is very much related to what I just said. So for them, it's like, this is an economic reason. I have a job that is offering me $200. I don't have much money in my household. I need money, and therefore I'm dropping out. Also, if you think about these kids, they might be optimizing. So if they go to school every day and they enter their math classroom and it's as if it's delivered in Chinese because they don't understand anything, they are continuously reminded that they don't know the very basics. These kids are so behind in terms of their academic readiness that they are ashamed of asking simple questions. It's like, how do you get to 2 + 2 = 4? They won't ask that. And so at the same time, the labor market is offering them, because the legal working age in Mexico is 16, the labor market is offering them some attractive wages, so they just drop out. And I think that they are not being dishonest when they say, no, it's economic reasons. I really need this money, and there is an option for me to get it. Now, I'll try to answer your question on the political economy. I don't think there's a right answer. Not using reason. So one has to use an ideological position. It's like, imagine that you're trying to implement kind of a revolution without being violent. So if you want to do that, then everything that has been done in the past is wrong, and you have to dismantle it. So a revolution is not that you're going and targeting certain things that are wrong to strengthen the institutions, to build the institutions. No, it's like everything is wrong. That's neoliberal. These conditional cash transfers are neoliberal. I showed these results. Many times to the current administration, to the previous administration, and there is something that is called clientelism, right? And this creates the set of incentives for such that the politicians, they like having these scholarship programs. It's very costly to reduce them. It's actually in their benefit to just increase them, because these guys, they will vote in 2 years' time, right? So it wasn't that difficult when my boss went to the Congress 10 years ago, showed problems, And we got immediately some funding to deliver 300,000 scholarships because the politicians, they like that. The problem is going back. So it's a matter of the ideological position of the current government. Now, the last question on CCT and learning, whether we will be able to use CCTs to address the learning crisis, the answer from my point of view, even with Progress Opportunity, is no. So it's much more complex than just giving money. If it was just a cash transfer, it would be good news because it's just a matter of money, but it's not. It's something much more complex, which starts with a good early childhood development program, with primary school system that works, that manages to give all the kids the minimum foundational skills.
Great. Okay, I think we have time for another round of questions. Yeah, let's start with this gentleman in the blue suit in the front.
Thank you. My name is Bernard Ayensu, Ministry of Education, Ghana. Both scholarships. I want to know what the scholarship covered. What was it supposed to pay for? Was it just paying the fees for the kids to go to school? Or you had identified like items for books, or it was to pay for things that could promote learning of the kids, as opposed to just like paying fees for the kids to go to school?
That's great. And Asif? Hi, my name is Asif Mehman. I'm a graduate student at the George Washington University and have worked with UNICEF on girls' education before. My question is for Maulik. Could you, and I may have missed this, I apologize if I had missed this, could you talk a little bit more about the range of the gap between the high ability and low ability sort of sibling pairings, and whether that seemed to, whether, in my mind, I can think of cases where there's a high ability sibling, but the gap isn't very big between the two, and then there could be where the gap is significant, and whether that correlated with the decisions or preferences of the parents.
Question on the pricing interventions. So, and you probably didn't have enough time, but in both of these interventions, these are equilibrium prices and market settings, right? I mean, so you can't deduce structural parameters like willingness to pay or household preferences from movements along an equilibrium price shift. A price shift from the equilibrium, you're going to move along the envelope. So I'm just trying to figure out what additional you're putting into the paper to understand either willingness to pay for private tuition, which is a movement from the equilibrium, or inequality aversion when households have already maximized, right? I mean, and I'm just trying to figure out, I couldn't understand from either presentation on how you were tackling those. So I'm just wondering if you can tell us a bit about it.
Time for one more. All right, let's take it back to the center. Felipe, do you want to kick us off talking about the scholarships and what they were targeted towards, and then we'll again just go down the panel.
Sure. I want to answer, and I want to jump into the last thing that Rafa said, because I want to be provocative now that we have 4 minutes. So, what does the scholarship cover? Again, the scholarship was determined as $20. There was some calculation about opportunity cost involved. The opportunity cost of these kids is quite low because these are grade 4 and grade 3 individuals that presumably the returns are very low. But the scholarship didn't cover any. They didn't say things like you should cover textbooks or what. No, it was totally free. It was totally open. As in any other country, in developing countries, schools may charge. There are public schools, free public schools, but they may charge some fees that are voluntary. But the idea was, hey, we need to cover some of these. If there is an opportunity cost or if there is a direct cost, we can cover those with that. And now to the let me be a little bit provocative. So the idea of there is this idea that conditional cash transfer will not solve the learning outcome because precisely the structure of the conditional cash transfer is not done to solve a, for instance, student achievement problem. And so one argument that goes against that is, and by the way, and the next step is saying, hey, you need to do a conditional cash transfer coupled with supply side interventions that increase the quality of the education in the school, etc., or early childhood. So there is one component, for instance, what is clear in the Cambodia experiment, there is one component that talks about for instance, the effort that students can exercise and the effort that can family exercise. So it may be the case that you can start designing conditional cash transfers that induce higher effort and that can induce behavioral responses from families that may be conducive to learning outcomes. And that is something that I believe that is important. And that is one idea that is, for instance, behind informational interventions in which you try to change the behavior of the household. You try to change not only the investment of the household in terms of monetary investment, but also investment in terms of time, effort, etc., which may induce some effects on student achievement. So that is one idea that I just want to put into the floor.
All right, I'm going to leap Rafa for this round because it's just this question on kind of what the scholarship's covered, and let's go to Maulik.
And this provocation.
Yep. We're just gonna
Okay.
So the question about the heterogeneity by the gap between the low ability and high ability kids. So we looked at this, and if I remember correctly, we didn't really see any heterogeneity by that. So it wasn't really correlated with like the preferences parents had, as far as I remember. The second question, I thought it was for Priya, so I spaced out for the first 15 seconds. So I might get back to you after this conversation is over.
Okay, so I'll address Jishnu's question. So I think that's a really great question. So the results I showed you were definitely sort of partial equilibrium specifically for the service that particular NGO was providing. But as we started working there, we realized how thick the market is. Households have preferences over these services, and there are lots of service providers. So that's when we actually went back out and we've done an extensive survey of the other tuition providers in these markets to understand the supply side, and also an end-line household survey to understand households' preferences over these things. And then our plan is to do something structural, and we'd love to talk to you about that after this.
Great, and then so Rafa, you want to give a quick rejoinder on the cash transfers point?
Yeah. So just to answer your question, if you look at where the beneficiaries of PROVEMS are located, so they are located in the deciles 5, 6, and 7. So right now, what they are financing, for most of them, are leisure, is beers, going out. They are not really they are not meant to cover fees, because the fees in Mexico for upper secondary public schools is 0. Now, to go to your point, the Progresa started in 97, 98, and I know that it doesn't have an incentive structure like the one you were describing, but what we know from the impact evaluations of Progresa is that the impact on learning outcomes is basically 0. And I think that we've been trying hard, at least in Mexico, we've been trying to come around with solutions because we don't want to address the difficult route of improving teaching. So improving teaching involves putting evaluations for entry examinations, evaluating incumbent teachers, and then designing training programs that are related to what our teachers are failing on. But this has a political economy component that is very, very hard to tackle. And we've been trying to get around with demand side interventions. And I don't think we will be able to address the learning crisis as long as we do not address supply side restraints or constraints, right?
All right, so we are just about out of time. We've seen here the promise in Cambodia of these demand-side interventions and the limits in Mexico, and then how parents make these allocations both across kids and whether to decide in these after-school interventions. Fundamentally, one of the big takeaways here is how important the design of these matters, right? There's no such thing as a scholarship intervention. There's a particular kind of scholarship intervention that has distinctive impacts depending on how it's set up. So thank you. One more round of applause for our speakers.